Today on the Cameron Joel podcast, I am joined by Otis Lee. He is the author of a book entitled, and I have it here, I was born in the forest. And this has to do with Africans who refused to be enslaved in Brazil and started their own towns in the forest away from people. It says here, I was born in the forest chronicles the struggle for liberty by Africans transported to the Americas aboard slave ships from regions including Congo, Angola, and other parts of Central Africa. Despite facing the oppressive systems of Holland and Portugal during the 17th century, these captured individuals mounted a triumphant fight against enslavement. In the 17th century, rather, they escaped and established Afrocentric communities in the mountains of Brazil, some of which became forerunners of black towns in America. And this is their story. So, welcome, Otis, to the Cameron Journal podcast.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So, why don't we start right from the beginning? Why don't you tell us a little about yourself and your book?
Okay. I am a retired lawyer. I practiced law for about 40 years between the states of Pennsylvania and Virginia. And I got involved in writing about 20 years ago after I retired from the law. And I found that I really enjoyed the process of writing and discovered that I had a talent for it and decided to continue with the writing. And I began by writing a memoir of my life and genealogy. And I was motivated to do that because of the 9/11 tragedy. And the New York Times, as you may recall, published excerpts of some of the victims, and they gave a small biographical sketch of each person. And I said to myself that I really would like for my kids to have more of a story about what I thought about life, about the world, and give them a real idea about my family connection and the family connection with them. And I just thought that I wanted to leave them something in writing, which is much stronger, of course, than just having an oral kind of memory of things. So that started the project. And of course, after that got started, it just ballooned and kept growing, and I kept writing. And eventually I finished the memoir after about 10 years of writing. And then I was looking for a second book. And I wanted to discuss the issue of African Americans trying to repatriate to Africa and all of the issues inherent in that. And so my wife wrote a journal about her experience in Uganda. And I took that, rewrote it, and then I added the story of one of her mentors, a lady named Dr. Harriet Karuji, who was a retired professor from Columbia in the area of nursing education. And so their experiences are melded together in a book called The Last Train from Djibouti, which is a memoir of, I should say, a metaphor for African Americans and their inability to go back home, so to speak. So that's what that book is about. And it tells about their experiences trying to get back to reconnect with their lost culture. And then, of course, the last book is I Was Born in the Forest, was motivated by my trip to Brazil in 2012. And I didn't know anything about the Columbo movement, but after having been exposed to it over there in Brazil, I was just fascinated by this subject. The fact that we had Africans who came over from Africa, who were captured and brought in to the Americas, of course, by force on slave ships in horrible conditions. And when they were placed into slavery, some of them refused to be enslaved. Some of them rebelled against it and went into the mountains and the hills and established Afrocentric communities there. And one of them, the most prominent of the Columbos, was known as Palmares. And of course, that maroon settlement lasted for almost 100 years, from 1605 to 1694. I just thought it was a tremendous story that many Americans of African descent in the United States do not know about, as well as a lot of other people, white people don't know about it, but it is known by certain African history scholars and other anthropologists who studied African history in the Americas. So known by a very small cadre of people, but unknown by the vast majority of the people. And I just thought it was a fascinating story, one that Americans of African descent could learn a lot from because there are a lot of lessons there. And it fascinated me, and I did a lot of research on it. Took about 6 years to write the book, and I was very, very satisfied with the product and the story. And I'm still doing research on that subject even now. We're planning on going back to Brazil sometime in the uh, near future to perhaps get a film made of some of the Columbos and the experiences of Afro-Brazilians in that context.
No, that's amazing. What motivated your trip to Brazil in 2012?
Say again, I didn't hear the question. Go ahead.
Yeah, what motivated your trip to Brazil in 2012?
Well, I had to go to Brazil because Brazil has more African descended people than any other place in America other than Nigeria. And since I always travel with the view of trying to continue to shape my worldview, I want to go to places where the African diaspora exists. And Brazil had to be on the list because we know that in Bahia, which is on the northeast coast of Brazil, we have the largest Black city in the Americas. And it's actually the largest Black state in America. Of course, there are whites there that live there as well. But that's its main historical relevance. And so I just had to go to Brazil because of its central role in the history of Americans of African descent and the African diaspora.
No, that's incredibly interesting. I love one of the things that kind of drew me to this book and this interview. The George June, who was a professor of Africana Studies when I was in college, had written a book on the town of Deerfield in Colorado, which was one of the very first Black towns created right at the end of the Civil War. And it unfortunately has been lost to the plains. It's wheat fields now. But it was he had talked a lot about that, and we'd kind of driven out at one point, kind of all of us to kind of see where the town was and all this type of thing. And Colorado was a bit unique because we did not participate in the Civil War. We didn't care. We have no stake in that fight. So we sold gold to both sides. Colorado is known for having the Civil War battle farthest west because the South was trying to come steal our gold, as one does. And the wonderful opportunity that Deerfield offered, the formerly enslaved to go and live in this town. So I was immediately drawn into your book. Because of that. So what was, give us a flavor. What was life like for these people in the 17th century in these towns in the mountains? What was it like out there?
Well, obviously, it's difficult to go back and place yourself in that context, but based on the historical records that I have examined, let's talk about Palmares, the largest one. There were certain common lifestyle arrangements that these people were able to put together to survive. First of all, they were very ingenious people. And by that, I mean they brought a lot of their culture from Central Africa. A lot of these Africans came from what we know as Congo today, and also Angola, and in other places along the Gold Coast, the western part of Africa. They brought with them the ability to cultivate rice, for example. They knew how to build fortresses to protect their settlements and their immediate villages. They were agriculturalists to a certain extent. They knew how to raise certain crops and how to use trees and all that sort of thing, various types of species of trees for various medicinal purposes, for housing, and an abundance of cultural attributes that they brought with them. So after they absconded from slavery, they went into the mountains and they found areas in the mountains that were populated by palm trees. The word palmares comes from palm tree. It's the transliteration of the word in Portuguese to palmares. And so it means palm trees. These Africans went to areas populated by palm trees because the palm tree had the coconut, which they could use for to eat. They could use the meat of the coconut to eat. They could use the coconut juice to drink. And also the palm trees were used for the roofs of their villages. They could also use the bark of the palm tree for insulation, for flooring. So they were able to use the palm tree for so many uses. And that kind of was one of their main crops that they were able to utilize and to apply their cultural skills to live in the mountains. So they were able to grow crops, manioc and cassava. And a lot of the slaves, in slavery in South America, one of the main crops was manioc. It's a type of flour that is used to bake certain types of foodstuffs. And so they knew how to cultivate that. They cultivated other kinds of vegetables, and they were able to live based on their ability to grow their own crops and to harvest them and save them in times of the winter season and when they were under attack. So they lived in a very tight community. Palmares had at one time somewhere between 20 and 30,000 slaves living there. And so they had their community organized. And let me say this, the word Columbo actually means a series of villages. And these villages were called Macambos. So a group of Macambos then constituted a Columbo. And so Palmares had between 9 and 11 different villages spread from the state of Alagoas all the way down to Bahia on the northeast coast. And each village had a village leader. And each of the village leaders were part of the leadership council. And the leadership council was headed at various times by different African leaders of Palmares, the most prominent of whom was Ganga Zuma, who led Palmares through most of the 17th century. He was overthrown in 1678, and then his successor, his nephew called Zumbi, was the leader who led Palmares until it was finally defeated in 1694. So how did they live? They lived like regular people, establishing their own communities, just like people lived probably in the 17th century in Africa. They had their own communities. They raised livestock to the extent that they could get livestock. They cultivated vegetables, and they also traded with neighboring towns near the Columbos in exchange for the baskets and the crafts that they made. They were able to exchange that for various things to help them in their subsistence. So they were ingenious people. They knew how to survive. They came out of a survival culture in Africa, and so they just took that culture and brought it to the Americas and established their main community there, known as Palmares in the northeastern sector of Brazil.
Yes, and then obviously once this little civilization comes apart in 1694, where did people go after that?
Well, that's an interesting part of the history. And I don't know if we have enough time to go through all of it, but let me just give you kind of an abbreviated portion of it. Palmares existed, as I said earlier, from about 1605. Some historians say it may have started as early as 1600. It existed as an autonomous Afrocentric community all the way from about 1600 to 1605, all the way to 1694, when it was finally defeated by the Portuguese. Now, in that within that period of time, they were under attack constantly by the Dutch and by the Portuguese, trying to defeat them. You see, because absconding from slavery was the most costliest way that slaves rebelled against slavery. It cost the slave masters more to have slaves go into the mountains and establish communities than any other form of resistance that the slaves could muster. So it was very much to the advantage of the slave masters if they could defeat this process, defeat this community, so that slaves would not be attracted to go and join them. However, just the opposite happened. The more Palmares succeeded in its survival, more Africans learned about it, and they all wanted to go to Palmares. So they were under attack many, many times during the course of their existence. However, in 1678, Gangazuma, the head of Palmares at that time, because he was taxed so heavily because of the attacks, he was worn out fighting, he wanted to sue for peace. So he approached the Portuguese and he wanted to see if they could reach an agreement, a treaty, a peace treaty to settle their differences and to save his people from having to continue to fight off all of these attacks. Right. He attempted to do that and he was successful. He reached an agreement. However, the Portuguese were full of subterfuge and chicanery. They buried certain clauses in the agreement that the Palmarinos ultimately decided that they did not like. So Gangazuma reached an agreement, but the leadership in Palmares rebelled against the agreement. And the principal reason they rebelled was because the agreement required that the Palmarinos return to slavery those slaves that had gone to Palmares in the latter years. In other words, those slaves that were not born in Palmares, those that went from the slave plantations and stayed but were not born, they were required to be returned into slavery. Well, the leadership in Palmares rejected that. They didn't want to have any part of that, and that led to the overthrow of Gangazuma. The overthrow of Gangazuma was led by his nephew, Zumbi. Zumbi then assumed the leadership of Palmares, and he led Palmares from 1678 to its final defeat in 1694. And it's a very tragic kind of story during that interim period because the agreement that Gangazuma reached with the Portuguese, in effect, divided Palmares into the old Palmares and the new Palmares, because some of the residents of Palmares went with Gangazuma to an area that was designated for them to go based on the agreement. And when they went to this area, as the years passed on, the agreement was broken by the Portuguese. They slaughtered all the people who went to this area, women and children, and they re-enslaved them. And only the Palmarinos, those persons who were living in Palmares who did not go with Gangazuma, the ones who stayed with Zumbi and decided to fight, were able to survive. So it's a very tragic story. The Portuguese reneged on the agreement, tricked these people into going to an area that was closer to the shore, closer to where the Portuguese authorities lived. And of course, it was like laying down your arms, so to speak, as you have read and heard when you have groups who are fighting for freedom. A lot of times the aggressor wants you to lay down your arms, wants you to in effect abdicate all of your rights and so forth. So those persons in Palmares that decided to follow Gangazuma went to this area, and they were there for a while. But then things broke down. The Portuguese were angry because Zumbi had attempted to overthrow and did overthrow Gangazuma. And they thought that was an abrogation of the agreement. They said the agreement was no longer in effect. That gave them the rationale to go in and destroy the people, and they did. And only those that did not go with Gongazuma were saved. And those are the ones that fought until the end in 1694.
I mean, what a story. So I imagine then that was the end of Afrocentric communities in Brazil.
No, it wasn't. It was just the end of a segment of the history.
Mm.
You see, it's kind of like a root that's in the soil. You may cut off the top of the root, top of the shrub or the plant, but the root is still in the ground. So after Palmares was defeated, other uh, quilombos were established because slaves all over Brazil were still absconding from slavery. And the word was out that, Palmares had been successful for almost 80 years. And so other Quilombo communities sprang up.
Mm.
And so they established themselves. As I indicate in the book, there are currently over 5,000 Quilombo or descendant Quilombo communities existing in Brazil today. And so the Portuguese ended a segment of the history, but they could not extinguish the will of these Africans to be free.
And so it goes throughout the story of the African diaspora in the New World, and so it goes. That
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. That's quite that's quite remarkable, and what a story. Let's talk about process a little bit. How do you like to write? How did the book come together?
All right. Well, uh, my style is perhaps not uncommon for writers. As a lawyer, I'm obviously very research oriented. So you will see in all of the books I've written that they all have a certain level of research and authentication and authorities to substantiate facts or declarative statements that are made about events that occurred. Um, so the first thing that I always do is I get certain notable reference books and try to read as much as I can about these subjects. And in the Palmares book, the Columbo book, I did extensive research on this subject. And of course, I had traveled to Brazil, visited some Quilombos earlier, had pictures and so forth and so on. And so I do the research that kind of sets the palette, if you will. Um, Once that is done, then I bring it all together in a creative kind of tapestry where I try to tell the story based on the history that has been made available to me. And for example, the book we're talking about starts out by talking about the colonialization of the story. And by that, I mean that a lot of the historians who have written about Black history write the story from a white supremacist point of view. They do not talk about the successes of Black people, and they don't talk about how the message about Black people has been colonialized. So that's what happened with Palmares. Palmares, the story of Palmares was not known for many years. The heroism of Gonga Zuma and Zumbi was suppressed by the Portuguese, all of that sort of thing. And so that suppression kept the people from knowing about this rich history. So the first thing I do is to discuss that. And there have been a lot of research done by scholars and academicians who have uncovered this subject and talked about it. So we talk about that a bit. And then from there, we move to the story of my trip to Brazil in 2012, and how that experience opened my mind to the fact of these Columbos and how Afro-Brazilians live, and some of the social issues that affect their population. So I write about that, and then I start talking about my introduction to Columbos and the personalities that I met and their stories, and that led into then discussing the actual history of Palmares. And we talk about that. And then as we get near the end, we try to, how does this relate to Americans of African descent today? What lessons can be learned? What lessons can be gleaned from the history of these people? As you know, people of color in the United States, Americans of African descent, are similar to the Palmarinos, the people occupied Palmares. They're under attack. They're constantly being besieged by policies and cultural devices that want to knock them back and keep them from succeeding. Well, the Palmarinos taught us that what's important is perseverance. You must persevere in this struggle. These people persevered against enormous odds. This was slavery. This was the colonial period. There was terrible injustice and all kinds of deprivations of one kind of another. So perseverance is a story that we learn from the Palmarinos. We also learn that the Palmarinos were able to come together as a community because they had a common foe. And so they were able to come together and bind themselves together because they knew they were under attack and they had to do certain things to protect their communities. So protection of the community is another value that can be derived from the history of Palmares. And also, we talked about establishing Afrocentric communities in Brazil. This is important. The colonialists thought that the Africans had no culture, that they didn't know how to do anything, that they couldn't lead themselves, they could not run their own communities, they couldn't govern themselves. Well, the Palmarinos, put that taboo to bed because they showed the Portuguese that not only did they know how to survive, but they had a government, they had a system of justice, they had a religious area. So they were able to govern themselves, but they brought their culture from Africa to Brazil and then to their maroon communities and set up their communities. So we get cultural survival, Afrocentric cultural survival. And the interesting thing about the Afro-Brazilians, they're closer to Africa than we are in North America. So the culture of Africa is more dominant there than it is in for other areas, especially in North America. So they were able to use their African culture to help them survive, and they were able to protect their African culture, which is something that is very important for the survival of people of African descent. So acculturation rather than purely assimilation is what the Palmarinos were able to achieve, and they were able to keep their societies going. So these are the lessons to me that make this story so relevant to Americans of African descent today. The perseverance, the defense of their communities, cultural survival, and their ability to bind themselves together to fight a common foe. These are great lessons. So I discuss that near the end, and then I give a prescription that I think, as a layman, of how the reparations for the injustice of slavery could be addressed in America. So we go from a discussion of the colonialization of the African story to the traveler's guide about traveling to Brazil and the adventures that we had there, introduction to Columbo's. Then we discuss about the Palmarinos and Palmares, how they were able to survive, and we talk about the history and so forth. And then we conclude by talking about the legacy of Palmares and what it means to Americans of African descent.
No, that's tremendous. That's tremendous work. And certainly, yeah, I mean, in America, we have, pockets of African culture that survived, like the Gullah Island in South
Yes,
Carolina,
yes.
memorialized in a popular 90s TV show that was my childhood. It was a cute little show on Nickelodeon, Gullah Island. I love that show. And only years later did I find out it was, you know, had this whole history behind it. And this sort of thing. I mean, yeah, it is interesting how African culture survived much more in Brazil, in parts of the Caribbean, than it ever has, here sort of thing. And yeah, no, I think tremendous lessons and a wonderful history of the African diaspora in the New World that is, we've waited a long time to have this sort of stuff written down and talked about in a competent way. So hats off to you for doing this hard work and all the travel and legwork and writing it takes to make it happen.
Yes, well, I appreciate that. It was a labor of love. I just feel very strongly about injustice and to make sure that the story of African people is promulgated, is discussed, is extremely important because African people of African descent, we have a tremendous history. If you read the writings of Basil Davidson, for example, the English historian who's written on Africa quite a bit, you will see that the Africans were involved with iron and copper and all of these kinds of metals well before the Europeans were. We had ancient communities in Nubia, in Kush, and in Meroe where we had societies and we did so much in terms of cultural attainment. And of course, the Egyptians were essentially, they were Africans. So if you can get that information, that culture, that history over to our people, many of them know it, a lot of them don't know it. But if we can get an appreciation for the heritage, for the history, I think that will go a long way toward helping alleviate some of the ills that are in our communities because a lot of us don't know what we should be proud of. And there's so much to be proud of, so much African history that is unknown and not given fair treatment in the media. So that
No, I think that's I mean I think
motivation.
that's true and I definitely, in the present period I feel like there is um a lot of sort of very negative stereotypes and very negative narratives against, you know, the Black community, especially, in and sometimes it happens for good reason. Louis Farrakhan says something stupid, the Hotep guys say something stupid and it hits social media and it's all over. And sometimes it's kind of like, keep these away from social media, like sort of thing. But I also feel strongly that people sort of, at least in this country, I think there's a very strong desire to stop having a conversation about race in this country. Like people are over it, they're done with it. Like, I have people who are friends of mine who are traumatized by 2020 and the George Floyd protests. You think they'd been to war. Um, and all this sort of thing. And I feel like people just really want to move on from that conversation. And so I think there's a tension right now where in communities of color, we're not done having that conversation. In many ways, we've just gotten started. And you have a large group of white people that are kind of like, can we finally move on from that? Like, Barack Obama was elected. Can we be done now? Sort of thing. And they just don't want to engage. What do you think about that?
Well, um, I don't think too much of it. I think
Well, that's
that,
okay.
I think that you have to know your history in order to know how to approach current day situations. Your past informs to some degree your present. You have to know your history in order to know how to approach certain things. That's why you asked me earlier about traveling. I have been to probably over 95 countries or 100 countries, and I am always interested in learning about the culture of people. Um, you see, everything that in the Western world, especially a lot of the Western European countries, South America and North America, so much of these countries and the wealth that they have attained was attained on the backs of Africans and slavery. The greatest cruelty and inhumanity to a people witnessed by humanity was the enslavement of Africans. And so we can't be done with it. We can't act like it didn't happen because so many people in this world are beneficiaries of that sacrifice, of that enslavement of African people and people of color. Now, don't forget that many indigenous people, Indians in Brazil, Indians in the United States, were also enslaved. And of course, the colonialists, in many instances, abandoned the enslavement of Indians because they found out that the Africans were more hardy, more physically adaptable. They could stand the pain, if you will, better. And so consequently, it was more economical to use Indians rather than indigenous people. But the point is, you cannot move on until you clean out the wound. You can't just put a band-aid on this because when you take the band-aid off, the wound is still there. And until this issue is really addressed and positive solutions are put in place, I don't see how passing it off and saying it does not that it was in the past, that it doesn't matter, has any credence at all. You see, I talk in the book the concept in the law of wills and trusts, which I worked in extensively. You see, when you inherit property from an ancestor, you get all of the benefits of that property. Even though you may not have worked a day in your life for it, the fact that you inherit it gives you a tremendous step up. The beneficiaries in the Western world of African slavery are living out the benefits that they got from the enslavement of our ancestors. The beautiful edifices, the beautiful buildings, all of the richness, a lot of this stuff was paid for by Africans due to their enslavement. So you can't move on because you're living as a result of it. The many benefits that we live and enjoy predicated on the backs of enslaved people. So you can't say that you're not responsible because you are an inheritor of that wealth. You are a beneficiary of the past, and that past included the enslavement of African people. And that's why the issue of reparations is important. And let me say this before we move on. It has been written in the history about Palmares by the academicians in South America that the Columbo movement is a form of reparations. And in fact, the Afro-Brazilians have taken the issue of reparations further than Americans of African descent in North America, because the Columbo movement has been codified in Brazilian law to the extent that descendants of these slaves that established these communities, such as Palmares, are now entitled to that land by law if they can prove that they are descendants of those African slaves that inherited that land. That's a form of reparations, a reparatory benefit to pay the descendants of these slaves for the labor that their ancestors undertook, that were forced to provide. So it's a form of reparations. So until you get a substantive remedy for the underlying problem, it's just a band-aid.
No, no. I mean, I think there's, I I myself have never been a huge fan of reparations because I think it just wouldn't necessarily be effective at this juncture.
Hmm.
I'd rather see that money be invested elsewhere for other reasons. But I definitely, I mean, it is, I think it's a tremendous and wonderful thing that they have managed to take that so far, get that codified in law, and maintain that landing community and heritage in that land such as it is. Certainly, that's far more than anyone around here has. So that I mean that's a really a quite tremendous thing, and perhaps maybe a blueprint for for the future. I think it's really hard to have that argument and sometimes that conversation with people because the average person, especially the average white person, comes along and says, "My family has never owned slaves. Why on earth should I feel guilty about something that happened long before I was born?" This is the debate being had nowadays. And I love how you put that to say, well, we're living in the results of all that labor, the wealth that was generated, the real objects that were created, all this type of thing. It's like it's kind of it's like well, it's like really it's like a lot of this, especially in the United States, like our country was built on the back of this for checks notes 250 years before we had to have a whole war about the damn thing. And here, here we are. And to say that, well, because you personally didn't do it, or it happened before you were born, or your family wasn't involved, really denies the fact that would our country be what it is today without that? No. Our economic wealth was created on the back of cotton and indigo and tobacco.
Yes.
Without that, you don't get America. But I mean, the country wouldn't exist, sort of thing. Why do you think the white people got here and immediately brought over some Africans to get to work? Like there was a method to the madness.
Absolutely.
And I feel like that was well cataloged by the 1619 Project at the New York Times. And I'm really disappointed that there was scandal around that because now, especially for a lot of my MAGA viewers and friends of mine who are in that direction, they now, you know, believe like, well, that, clearly that there was this problem, so it's all a lie and this was all dumb and it's just more DEI sort of thing and all this sort of thing. It's a very difficult discussion and very difficult thing to have. So
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is difficult. But of course, you have to undertake difficult things in order to get the right answers and the right solutions to problems. You cannot run away from them. We all have to face realities at some point. Um, but
yeah,
it starts with knowing the truth and knowing the real history, and you can fight a lot better. I always say, and I've said in my books in one way or another, that you can play the game better if you know the rules. If you don't know the rules, you're playing a game that you're unfamiliar with. You don't play the game as effectively. And I
right.
think our people, Americans of African descent, it begins with knowing our history, have an appreciation for that history, a respect for that history, and then taking those lessons and applying it in the modern day world to the various circumstances that we confront. As I said earlier, what I get from the Palmares story is perseverance, is defense and appreciation of community and cultural survival. You know, uh, we often see on TV all of the various types of European histories displayed, the Italian history, the English history. We get inundated with that stuff, but we don't see very much African history. It's not as prominently displayed in the media. And that's because we live in a predominantly white country, and it's understandable. But nonetheless, we have a duty then, because of that deprivation, to try to get to the bottom of that history, elucidate it, get it known, get it out, understand it, realize it, appreciate it, and get it to the youth so that they will know that they come from something, that they have something to be proud of, that this is not just a fabricated life that you live, that people paid a lot of prices for you to be able to do what you do today. And it started centuries ago. So you have to appreciate your history in order to take advantage of the present.
No, no, and I think that's an excellent spot to close out at. We're approaching the top of the hour. Why don't you let us know where we can keep up with you online and where we can buy the book?
All right, very good. The book is available on Amazon. It's also Apple Books, iTunes. It's also can be purchased through my website, um, and the book is also being translated into Portuguese. And it's a very, let me give you a little very interesting story. I just returned from Brazil where we did some post-publication research, and we visited some additional Columbos, about 9 of them, and we met a professor of African history. I talked to him about my book. He had just written a book similar to mine, and his daughter lives in Lisbon, and we hooked up, and she is doing a translation of the book. And so that should be out sometime the latter part of this year. And so we will have a Portuguese version for the Brazilian public and those in Portugal. And of course, we have the English edition. So Amazon is a great place to start to get the book. Apple Books has it. And of course, my website. And of course, you can send me an email at nanayaw1126@gmail.com. I'll be glad to send it to you. And also the books are on audio. All of my books are in audio format as well. So a number of ways to get it. And the publisher has a website with the book on it as well. Many ways to get the book if you want to get it.
Excellent. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it very much.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.